Just to sort of refresh our memory, our theme for this week is the last link broken. And that's a reference to a quote in the Desire of Ages, the It Is Finished chapter, where Ellen White states that the last link of sympathy between Satan and the unfallen worlds and the angels was not broken until Calvary. It wasn't broken at the fall of Adam and Eve. It wasn't broken when Lucifer left heaven. It wasn't broken at the flood, Sodom and Gomorrah. That last link of sympathy between the angels and the unfallen worlds wasn't broken until Calvary. So last night we talked about how those links were formed by Satan up in heaven. Today I want to spend our time looking at what he was actually saying. And it may not be always clear to us that we have access to what he was actually saying, but the Bible gives us some allusions to, and actually outright in a few places tells us what Satan was saying up in heaven to actually win over the affections and the minds of the unfallen beings and the angels up in heaven. The topic I was given to speak from by the planning committee was on the book of Job. So last night's talk was on the origin of great controversy. Dee's talk this morning was on how that controversy spread to the earth. And then I was asked to talk on the topic of Job. And interestingly, in the story of Job, we will see what those arguments were that Satan was making up in heaven. So before we jump into our topic, I'm going to kneel, and it's fairly hard for you to kneel here, so I'll just ask you to bow your heads, and we'll ask the Holy Spirit to be with us again. Dear Heavenly Father, I just want to confess to you that I'm a man of unclean lips, and if we're honest, I would say I'm in the midst of an unclean people. But you've condescended, Lord, to be willing to dialogue with us, to engage with us, to enter into our experiences and our meetings, to draw us closer to you, to help us understand the issues that we struggle with, sometimes in the big picture of the great controversy, sometimes in our day-to-day lives. And we recognize, Lord, that every day we're making decisions for your kingdom or for another kingdom. So, Lord, I just want to confess our great need of your Spirit, his humbling, edifying influence. We confess that we know in this great controversy that there are evil angels who desire to inject their thoughts, and even more than their thoughts, their attitude and their pride into our minds, into our hearts, into our meetings. And Lord, there's holy angels here also who want to beat back the influence of the evil angels, to speak to our minds thoughts of peace and of love for you and love for each other, an appreciation for the great truths of the Bible and of this great conflict. And so, Lord, I want to speak for myself and for each one of us here. We want to listen to your Spirit and listen to those holy angels. We ask you to push back the evil angels and to push back the lower attitudes and the lower emotions of our nature and allow us to be edified by your Spirit in this hour. In Jesus' name, amen. So again, last night we talked about the Godhead's love in eternity past and how they ventured out of that great love to enter into creation, out of a desire to share that friendship that they had amongst themselves, to share that friendship with other created beings. And they took that what would turn out to be a very, very painful step that would end at Calvary in creating us. And they started their creation with this most amazing being who the Bible calls Lucifer, the light bearer. And he wasn't just God's worker or God's servant, God's employee. He was God's best friend. Desire of Ages tells us that God the Son and Lucifer were, quotes, united in the closest ties, unquote. But that as Lucifer became to be self-aware of all the amazing talents and capabilities that God had invested him with, he began to be impressed with those qualities that God had blessed him with, and began to feel the need to promote himself, to take on a more significant position in heaven. And since the only one more significant than him in heaven was God, there was need for him to displace God. And in order to displace those above you, you need to create a sense that things aren't as good as they could be, that things are not that great, and there's problems. So Lucifer began to come up with ideas and concerns, and he shared those with other angels, and eventually convinced 1/3 of the holy, intelligent angels that his positions were credible. His positions had merit, and they should follow him. But the question is, how do we decide, and how would they have decided who was telling the truth? Was it enough for God to just say, listen, trust me, I'm telling you the truth? Or did there need to be a demonstration of the principles of God's kingdom in comparison to the principles of Satan's kingdom? And that would take time for those principles to be exemplified. So this has been the statement that I've sort of wanted to focus my time on with you a little bit. This was alluded to last night and a little bit this morning already, but I just want us to look back at this one more time, because in the story of Job, we're going to see an example of those links that Lucifer had formed with the unfallen angels, and those links that he's formed with us beginning to be broken. It says there in Education, page 154, unselfishness, the principle of God's kingdom, is the principle that Satan hates, and its very existence he denies. And we're going to see this coming through again and again, that Satan doesn't just dislike that principle. He says it doesn't even exist. God's not unselfish. God's people aren't unselfish. Basically, Satan's argument is the principles that I'm promoting of looking out for yourself, and he would identify that as freedom. If you look out for yourself, he would define that as freedom. That's the principle that we all operate on, including God. So from the beginning of the controversy, Satan has endeavored to do two things: to prove God's principle of action to be selfish, and also he deals in the same way with all who serve God. And we saw last night that before earth was created, he said those things about the angels who wouldn't follow him, that their principles were selfish, and also with all of us down here on planet earth who claim to follow God. So to disprove Satan's claim is the work of Christ and of all who bear his name. Now, after Ellen White makes that statement about selfishness, she goes on and she gives an example of this principle. So what's the principle? This one right here. That Satan is trying to prove that unselfishness does not exist, and he's doing that with all who serve God, and that to disprove Satan's claim was Christ's work and also the work of all who bear his name. And she goes on, she says, very early in the history of the world is given the life record of one over whom this controversy of Satan's was waged. Now, what was this controversy again? This controversy between does unselfishness exist? And the person she chooses to illustrate this point was Job. So the context for that Education 154 statement is Job is an example of this conflict between God and Satan, where Satan says unselfishness does not exist. Of Job, the patriarch of Uz, the testimony of the searcher of hearts was, there is none like him in the earth, a perfect man and an upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil. So Job is the example that she uses of this great conflict. So I want to spend a few minutes here looking at this story in the book of Job and see how those two principles come into play and how Satan uses them to make his arguments on his side of things. We're going to see that statement in Education 154 played out. It says there, now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. So there's these sons of God demonstrated here. And it doesn't really matter whether you think they're angels or whether you think they're intelligences from other created worlds. They're people in God's universe, beings in God's universe. And they're not passive observers in this. They're actually active participants in the drama that's about to unfold. They have the potential to take Satan's side in this controversy. Remember, there are links of sympathy between these sons of God and Satan. So Satan comes among them. Now, is what these sons of God think about God and think about Satan, is that important to God and Satan? Do they care what the sons of God think about them? Yes, right? God cares what the sons of God think about him, and Satan cares what the sons of God think about him. When Satan shows up in this meeting, is he some new person to them, or do they know him? They know him, right? This was the guy who we looked at last night. This was the guy who was the connecting link between divinity and God's creation. He was the light bearer, the bearer of truth. In fact, it said even some of the angels actually thought that Lucifer was the ruler in heaven. That statement in This Day with God we read. So they look at Lucifer and say, this is the guy that we knew from before. Now, do you suppose Lucifer showed up as an angel of light or as a monstrous beast, all hostile and angry? He shows up as an angel of light. He's going around shaking hands to all the sons of God. How have you been? I've missed you since God booted me out of heaven. It's great to see you again. How have things been going? They know him. Remember, he had the quotes, the heart of the universe. And here he is back and showing up again as courteous and as pleasant and as charitable as he ever was. Very courteous, very friendly. Goes on and says, so these angels are caring about Satan coming to them. Now, let's look a little bit for what they would be processing. We're told in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 12, that the gospel is something that the angels desire to look into. Now, when you desire to look into something, what does that tell you about your current understanding of that topic? You don't understand it completely, right? That's why you're desiring to look into it, because you don't completely understand it currently. Now, this statement is in 1 Peter after the cross. So they're desiring to understand the gospel at that point. What do you think their understanding was back when Satan came among them in the book of Job? Would be even less then, right? So their understanding of Satan's arguments and his positions was even less at that point than it was after the cross. So when Satan comes among them, his argument's going to be particularly persuasive. They're still looking into these things. Ellen White says this in Desire of Ages, page 761. This is again after the cross. She says the angels, after the cross, did not even then understand all that was involved in the great controversy. How much more would that be true in the book of Job about them understanding all that's involved in the great controversy? They would not understand all that was going on then. And that's why this story of Job is going to play out. And Satan shows up there, and he has an argument to make, a position to promote there. So it goes on. The Lord said to Satan, "From where do you come?" So Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro on the earth and from walking back and forth in it." Now, why does God ask this question? Is he accessing information that he's deficient in? Or does he want to project something? What do you think God's tone of voice is when he says to Satan, "From where do you come?" Was he angry? Was he saying, "What are you doing here? You don't belong here. This is my kingdom. Get out of here"? Or was God's tone of voice from his heart of love very pleasant? "Why are you here? What are you doing here?" And how does Satan respond? Does he respond angrily? "I have a right to be here. I'm representing earth"? No, they're both very aware that the sons of God are looking onto the circumstances and evaluating the characters of the two beings in conflict. Satan has said unselfishness doesn't exist. God has said, no, I have unselfishness towards you. I love you all. Who's telling the truth? So both are being patient, both are being articulate. Satan wasn't defiant. He wasn't angry or hostile. And he says, basically, I've been down on planet Earth doing ministry, working on behalf of the human race. I'll be honest, it's been a little difficult. Every time we make some progress, God destroys things. He destroyed everything with a flood. Yeah, it wasn't perfect, but people were experiencing their own freedom and making their own choices for my kingdom, and every time people do that, he just destroys them. He destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, and every time we don't do what he tells us, he just destroys us. It's been a little difficult to establish a successful kingdom now. God's always interfering. But we're ministering to the people down there. We're doing the best that we can. I just wish God would give us a little more latitude there. Now, interestingly, God goes on. Satan says, I've been down on planet Earth ministering and trying to develop a kingdom where people have freedom and autonomy, the right to pursue their own hopes and dreams. And God doesn't respond by saying, I'm the creator. The earth is still mine. He doesn't pull rank on Lucifer. He has a very specific argument towards Lucifer's claim to position and to sovereignty on the world. And this is what he says. Then the Lord said to Satan, remember, Satan just said, I'm working down on planet Earth trying to build up a kingdom. And the Lord says to Satan, well, have you considered my servant Job, that there's none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil? Why doesn't God pull rank? Why doesn't God say, listen, I'm God, I created that planet, Adam was my creation, you're my creation, it all belongs to me. So whatever you say in claims of sovereignty have no bearing with me. God doesn't say that because he knows that ultimately sovereignty has to do with gaining the hearts and minds of the ones who are being under the sovereign. You cannot win the hearts and minds of the people just by pulling rank and saying, I've got more power than you. He realizes that he has to have rulership based on the hearts and minds of those of us who want to follow him. Do we trust God because of his power or because of his goodness? So God puts forth an argument and says, listen, my standing on planet Earth is established by one named Job. There's none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil. So God's response to Satan is based on the goodness of his followers. I wonder if that has any implications for us today. God's claim to depend to sovereignty on planet Earth is dependent on his people. Now, what would Satan say in response? He would say, well, you just admitted there's none like him on all the earth. You've got one, Job. I've got everybody else. I'm not really sure they're voting for you. I kind of feel like they're buying into my ideas, my promotion of freedom. There were no other people like Job on the earth. And we'd have to ask the question, has God ever been really successful? We're told by the pen of inspiration that there's some few in every generation. Some few. Not a vast majority, not even a vast number. And yet God's basing his claim of sovereignty, of influence, of right to this world, not on his power as the creator, although he could do that, but based on the fact that someone down here actually thinks he's worthy to be the ruler. Someone actually believes that I should be the ruler here, that my principle should carry the day. I wonder if that's still true today. Is God looking for people like Job who can stand up on his inside and say, I believe in God's principles in this? Maybe that's something that whole final generation idea has. Maybe some few in every generation, while providing somewhat of an argument, is not as overwhelming as Satan's argument that I've got billions who see value in my side of things, and you've got some few in every generation. Maybe God needs to say, I have a whole generation that love my principles and love my character. So now Satan has a response to that. All right, you claim Job is your man. And you claim that he's operating on your principles and supporting your kingdom. I don't think so. I don't think unselfishness exists. Remember that statement, Education 154. Unselfishness, the principle of God's kingdom, is a principle that Satan hates. Its very existence he denies. And now he's going to deny it in the person of Job. Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you made a hedge around him, around his household, and around all that he has on every side? Have you blessed the work of his hands? His possessions have increased in the land. But let's test this, God. Let's just see if he's actually operating on your principles. He thinks you're so wonderful. He thinks your kingdom's so wonderful. Stretch out your hand and touch all that he has. Let me tell you, he's actually operating on my principles. And when you take away all the stuff you've bribed him with, he'll surely curse you to your face. So what's the argument being presented here? Satan is saying, Job doesn't love you because you're good and beautiful and loving and unselfish. He's prostituted himself to you because you're giving him stuff. You've just bought him off. And there's two problems there, Satan saying. Number one, you bought him off and he responded to that. But number two, you're the kind of God that actually thinks that's a worthwhile arrangement. You're satisfied with bribing people to worship you. That's all that's going on here. You bribe him and he worships you. And what's really going on, Satan says, is you're validating my point that unselfishness does not exist. It doesn't exist in Job and it doesn't exist in you. You're just validating that point. So it's not just that Job is being questioned here and his motives. It's that God is being questioned. You're the kind of God who is satisfied with just buying people off. You know, we see these marriages every once in a while where there'll be like an elderly billionaire marries a 20, 30-something model. Now, we all know what's going on there, right? It's legalized prostitution. She's there for the money and he's there for the fun. And Satan's basically saying this is exactly what's happening between God and Job. It's prostitution. And this makes the important point. Good behavior. Now, Job has good behavior, but good behavior in and of itself doesn't prove or validate the goodness of God's character. Why not? Because right actions, even if we're doing the right thing from a foundation of self-interest, is actually an argument in favor of Satan's side of the great controversy. So if you're doing the right thing for selfish reasons, you're actually validating Satan's argument that unselfishness does not exist. So we can have all the right doctrines, all the right truths. We can be fastidious in our behavior in all the right areas. And fundamentally, it's all happening because we want our slice of the pie. And Satan is perfectly happy to build up an edifice of selfishness under the guise of religion. This is what makes papal theology so attractive. It's all about self-interest. In fact, every religion on the world is fundamentally based on self-interest, apart from a gospel-based religion where we say, I care more about you and more about God than I do about myself. Everything else is based on self-interest. This comes up all throughout the history. Are the disciples or us any different? Look at what the disciples said. Matthew 19:27. Now remember, this conversation between God and Satan, with the sons of God watching on, this was not a one-time episode in earthly history. That conversation is going on all the time. When Satan is called the accuser of the brethren, this is really what he's accusing about most. Now, sometimes he's got obvious things to accuse us about, right? There's just some blatant things that he can look at what they're doing. But with God's people, a lot of times it's more subtle. It's like, listen, yeah, they're doing some good things, but it's all because they're interested in self-preservation. It's all because they want their slice of the pie. Matthew 19:27. Here's Peter. He comes up and says, "See, we have left all and followed you." We've sacrificed. We left those fishing boats. They weren't the fancy fishing boats, but we left all that for you. And well, Peter, why did you do that? Why did you leave that fishing life for me? So we're wondering, Jesus, what shall we have? We're joining the Jesus Club. We're all into the Jesus Club. But just to make sure, I might have missed something in the fine print. At the end of this whole thing, what do we get? Because if there's nothing in it for me, I might not stay in the club that long. I might actually betray you if I'm in this club, if there's nothing at the end of this for me. Like if you're going to die on a cross, you're not going to set up a kingdom, I may not want to stay in that club. Well, the other disciples had the same issue. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came with their mom. Moms can be influential. They say to Jesus, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask." I wonder what they would want. Lord, help us to be more effective in our evangelistic outreach. Lord, help us to be more like you in character, more humble and more serving. Help us to understand God's issues and the great controversy and how we can stand on your side of things. That's probably what they want, right? We want you to do for us whatever we ask. And he said to them, "Well, what do you want me to do for you?" So they said to him, "Well, we've got a little request, and when this whole thing wraps up, whenever it wraps up, grant us that we may sit one on your right hand and the other on your left hand in your glory." Do you see those two antagonistic principles here? What's Satan saying? So again, that story in Job, just apply it to James and John. Satan says to God says, "Listen, I've got 12 disciples." And Satan says, "Do James and John serve you for nothing? If they're not getting a slice of the pie at the end, they're not hanging in there, I'll bet." And sure enough, James and John fall right into that. We want you to do for us whatever we ask. We want to sit on the right and the left. Now the other disciples were observing this, and when the 10 heard it, they began to be greatly displeased with James and John. Now I wonder why they were displeased with James and John. Probably because they were concerned for their salvation. They said, James and John are on the wrong side of the great controversy. They're standing up for Satan's side. We need to be concerned for their eternal salvation. That's probably why they were displeased, right? They're like, man, we should have thought of that first. Man, we should have brought our mothers to convince them that we could get to sit on the right and the left. Man, well, we can be maybe front and back. They can have the right and left, and we can have the front and the back. No, they were upset because they said, we wanted the right and the left. Well, we'd like to think this is an in-house problem that we have, that nobody really knows, that we might be doing this Christianity thing, and the Muslims are doing the Muslim thing, and the Hindus doing the Hindu thing, all for self-interest. But our nakedness is showing. Here's Richard Dawkins, a very well-known atheist. He says this: do you really mean to tell me that the only reason you try to be good is to gain God's approval and reward, or to avoid his disapproval and punishment? You know, the Bible talks about the shame of our nakedness and don't let your nakedness be seen. He's exposing our nakedness. He's saying, listen, he's echoing Satan's charge up against Job, isn't he? You guys are only doing this religion thing to get a slice of pie. Your principles, Richard Dawkins is saying, and Satan is saying, your principles are no different than our principles. You have a survival of the fittest mindset in religion. So you can tell us in evolution that we don't know about love and all those kind of things, but all you're doing is survival of the fittest. You've just picked a different survival of the fittest club to belong to. And he says, that's not morality. That's just sucking up, apple polishing, looking over your shoulder at the great surveillance camera in the sky. I think he's right. Is there any other reason to do this thing besides those? It's not the fear of punishment or the hope of everlasting reward that leads the disciples of Christ to follow him. Well, what else could there be? That's it, right? That's all the motivations. Those are powerful motivations. I don't want to experience punishment. I like rewards. That's a pretty powerful motivation. There actually is another motivation. It's not fear of punishment or hope of reward that leads the disciples of Christ to follow him. They behold something. They behold the Savior's matchless love revealed throughout his pilgrimage on earth from the manger of Bethlehem to Calvary's cross. And the sight of him attracts. It softens and subdues the soul. Then something happens. They see something and something happens in them. Love awakens in the heart of the beholders. They hear his voice and they follow him. See, you can't try harder to change your motivation. You can, through effort, change your behavior. You know, sometimes we're variably successful with that. You can change your behavior merely by self-discipline. Some people are more self-disciplined. They can change their behavior quite easily. Some are less self-disciplined. It's harder to do, to change your behavior. But you cannot change your motivations through self-discipline. You can only change your motivations through beholding. That's why it says in Jeremiah, a leopard can't change his spots, an Ethiopian can't change his skin, then may you who are accustomed to doing evil start doing good. Because you can change your behavior, but you can't change your motivation. It's only in the realm of perception and seeing and understanding and beholding. By love is love awakened, we're told. This is what the 1888 message was intended to do. It wasn't intended to give us a new set of theological tenets to add to the 28. It was intended to be a message to melt our hearts and attract us to Jesus. That's why so often when Ellen White describes what was being preached, she talks about the matchless charms of Jesus, the preciousness of Jesus. Jesus was very near. On and on she had these descriptions of what was happening to people as the messages were presented. And it wasn't a mere theological assent to doctrinal truths. Hearts were changed. Here's another one. The shortness of time is urged as an incentive for us to seek righteousness and to make Christ our friend. True statement? All the time. This is not the great motive. It savors of selfishness. So we could actually be appealing to people to join our movement, to join God's side. And again, God doesn't take care what motive you have when you come to him, but once you've come, he wants to change your motive. So if you're coming from a selfish motive, and I'm coming from a selfish motive, praise the Lord. That's where we're starting at. But he doesn't want to leave us there. Why? Because that motive ultimately savors of selfishness. It's ultimately based on the principles of Satan's kingdom. Well, what other motive is there? She goes on, is it necessary? Is this necessary that we do it this way? That the terrors of the day of God be held before us to compel us through fear to right action? This ought not to be. Then she says the most profound thing. Jesus is attractive. He's full of love, mercy, and compassion. That's the right motive. Jesus is attractive. 2 Corinthians 5:14 says what? The love of Christ is a constraining reality. As we see and process that reality, new emotions, new thoughts, new desires awaken in our hearts. Jesus is attractive. So I want to go on and look a little bit more in Job now with the time that we have left. Now, we'll come back to Job chapter 1 and 2. But let's look at Job chapter 4. This is an incredible passage that very rarely gets looked at. And one of Job's friends, Eliphaz, is speaking here. Remember, Job had all those bad things that happened to him. And interesting to notice the things in the book of Job that Satan has influence over, right? So Satan goes out and he causes fire to come down from heaven. He causes groups of people to destroy Job's possessions. He causes a great wind to come and knock down the house where his children were at. So Satan has incredible powers to work in the natural world and work on the hearts of people. But in Job chapter 4, Eliphaz is one of Job's 4 friends, and he starts to tell Job about a dream he had. Now notice, and we'll read this in detail in just a minute, but I want you to understand who is speaking in this passage in Job chapter 4. So Eliphaz is describing a dream that he had, or a vision that he had in the night. Now listen and see who's speaking. Now a word was secretly brought to me, Eliphaz, and my ear received a whisper of it. In disquieting thoughts from the visions of the night, when deep sleep falls on men. So he's describing a vision or a dream he had at night. Fear came upon me and trembling, which made all my bones shake. Then a spirit passed before my face. The hair on my body stood up. It stood still, but I could not discern its appearance. A form was before my eyes, and there was silence. Then I heard a voice saying, now this spirit's now going to speak, okay? Now, it's not immediately clear who this spirit is. Is it a good spirit or a bad spirit? Because with rare exceptions in the Bible, when created humanity encounters a supernatural influence, even if it's a good angel, we tend to respond with fear. Remember Daniel's experience and the ones that were around him. They all ran away, they were scared. And even Daniel was trembling, it said. So it's not immediately clear if this is a good spirit or bad spirit. But let's look at the next verse in Job chapter 4, verse 18. And look at what this spirit says. This spirit says, if God puts no trust in his servants, and if God charges his angels with error. Now, who would say God charges angels with error? Who would say that? Satan would say that. So now we know who's speaking, right? Now we know which spirit it was that came and spoke to Eliphaz, and then Eliphaz communicated to Job in Job chapter 4. So God puts no trust in his servants, and God charges his angels there. So now we know who's speaking here. It's clear that Satan is the one who's speaking, or one of Satan's angels. Now let's go back and look and see what was Satan saying in this dream to Eliphaz. The first thing he says is, can a mortal be more righteous than God? Can a man be more pure than his maker? So Satan is saying, God is demanding things of us that he himself doesn't do. God is demanding a standard of righteousness, of goodness, of purity, that he himself doesn't live up to. He's calling us to live in unselfishness, but he lives in selfishness. He's all about himself, and he calls us to be unselfish. He calls us to love our enemies. But how does he treat his enemies? Look at the flood. Look at the Sodom and Gomorrah. He doesn't love his enemies. He destroys them. And we're supposed to love our enemies? He demands sacrifice from us. We're supposed to do all this for him. But he's sitting up in heaven with all the angels doing his bidding. He's not sacrificing anything. He's living the good life. He's got the universal Club Med. He's demanding so much from us. The smallest infraction in this universe gets the death penalty. Look at those 10 commandments. Honor your father and mother. What if I don't? Death. Don't tell a lie. What if I don't? Death. Don't steal. What if I don't? Death. Don't covet. Death. Don't keep the Sabbath. Everything we do, he's threatening to kill us. Can a man be more righteous than God? He's so demanding. He's so overbearing and severe. This is what he's saying. Now, this Ellen White brings this out. The same thing in Great Controversy 502. Satan had accused God of seeking merely the exaltation of himself in requiring submission and obedience from his creatures, and had declared that while the Creator exacted self-denial from all others, he himself practiced no self-denial and made no sacrifice. Do you see that that's exactly what he's saying there in Job chapter 4? Can a man be more righteous than God? He's exacting self-denial from all others, but practices no self-denial himself. This is what Satan is saying in Job chapter 4, and this is his argument up in heaven before as the great controversy was beginning. I'll just give you a simple example of how this comes up a lot of times. How many times do we hear the idea, why was man created? What's the most common answer when someone says, why did God create man? For his glory, to serve him. Now, there's an element of truth to that, but many times what we're left with is the idea that, listen, God just creates everybody just to tell him how wonderful he is. God really created all these beings just so he could experience more self-exaltation for himself. And when we leave the impression that God created us to exalt himself rather than to give of himself, we're supporting that argument that Satan was making. God is not selfish, God is giving. And he created not to be exalted, but to lift up and bless others. Now, in response, as we see that, we want to exalt him. We want to say, man, he is worthy. But God didn't create us just so we could lift him up and tell him how wonderful he is. He created us to bless us. So Satan goes on through Eliphaz to Job in Job chapter 4, and he says this, if God puts no trust in his servants, and if God charges his angels with error. Now, who are the servants there in the first part of verse 18? Well, it's the same as the angels. You know, in Hebrew poetry, a lot of times there's a couplet. The Hebrew poets will say one thing and then they'll repeat it with slightly different words. So it says here, if God puts no trust in his servants, those servants are the ones that God charges with error in the second phrase, the angels. Now, how do you know that those servants in verse 18 are not us? Because in verse 19 he says, how much more those who dwell in houses of clay? That's us. So Satan is contrasting the servants and angels of verse 18 with us as humanity down here in verse 19. So Satan's basically saying God doesn't trust the angels, God doesn't trust the onlooking universe, he's always charging us with error. This is what Lucifer was saying up in heaven to the angels. God's accusing us. God's the accuser of the brethren. He's the one charging us with error. And the evidence that he doesn't trust us is he's micromanaging. He's telling us how to do everything. He's got all these laws and rules we have to follow. If he trusted us, if God trusted us, he would give us more liberty and not bind us up with these rules. And it gets back to, are God's laws warnings or are God's laws threats? If God gives a law and says, don't do that because it's going to damage you, that's a caution, that's a warning. If God gives a law and says, if you do this, I'm going to impose a bad penalty on you because I'm very upset, that's a threat. And that's the difference between how Satan portrays God's law and how God's law actually is. God's law is a system of love and benevolence that is internally consistent and leads to positive outcomes and consequences. Satan is the one who's saying, if you don't do what God tells you, he's just going to impose a bunch of negative penalties on you. It's all arbitrary. He just made this whole system up. So he's saying God doesn't trust the angels. He doesn't trust us. He's a micromanaging control freak. He goes on then in talks about us then in Job chapter 4, 17 through 20. How much more those who dwell in houses of clay, now speaking about us, whose foundation is in the dust. We were created from the dust. Who are crushed like a moth. They are broken in pieces from morning till evening. They perish forever with no one regarding. So what is Satan saying here through Eliphaz? He says, listen, this world is a disaster area. We're like a bunch of little bugs down here getting squished. We're broken in pieces all day. We're perishing forever. And there's no one who cares about it. God doesn't regard this or our situation. No one's regarding. He lives that life up in heaven of peace and benevolence and happiness. We're crushed like bugs with no one regarding. This is the origin of the theodicy concern, right? If God is so good, why is all this going on down here? And this is Satan's basic argument in Job chapter 4 and towards Job. This is the basis of most atheism. How could this all be going on down here and there be a good God overlooking all of this? And this is what Satan's bringing up here. So Satan is attempting to put God in what's called a catch-22. Now that's sort of an old term from the 70s, but a catch-22 is where whatever choice you make, there's a bad outcome. So Satan is trying to paint God into a catch-22 where whichever direction he goes, it's going to be a negative. So let's look how he does this. So in verse 20, he says, listen, in this universe, there's no one regarding. There's no God, at least no caring one. So on the one hand, if God steps back and allows things to take their course, what would Satan say? Nobody cares. We're just left here to ourselves. That's the basis of skepticism and atheism and deism. On the other hand, Job 4 verse 18, Satan says, God puts no trust in his servants. God is a micromanaging controller. So when God intervenes, Satan says, he's micromanaging and controlling everything. There's no freedom around here. But when God steps back and doesn't intervene, Satan says, look, he doesn't care about what's happening down here. So when God intervenes, it's painted negatively. And when God doesn't intervene, it's painted negatively. And you see those two philosophies in the world. Calvinism, determinism, which permeates religious thinking, not just in Christianity, but all sorts. Everything that happens to you is part of God's master plan. So no matter how incredibly malevolent something is that happens, well, we may not understand it, but God is in control. And on the other side, when things happen and it seems like God's not intervening, Satan says, yeah, he's not intervening because he doesn't care. So Satan is painting God in a negative light, whichever side of that you take. Now, I want to look at one other example of this catch-22. And this is referring a little bit to what Dee talked about this morning. But in the book of Genesis, chapter 2, verse 17, it says, in the day that you eat of it, you will surely die. Now, look briefly at how that plays out. And I want to skip down to Genesis chapter 3, verse 4 and 5. So Lucifer, or Satan, says to Adam and Eve, if you eat of the fruit, you will not surely die. Now, clearly there's a contrast, right? God says, if you eat of the fruit, in the day you eat of it, you're going to die. Lucifer says, if you eat of it, you're not going to die. Now, when they eat of the fruit, now remember, this is all occurring just like Job chapter 1 and 2 with all the sons of God watching. When they eat of the fruit and they don't die, who does it appear to be was telling the truth, God or Satan? It appears on the surface in that moment that Satan was telling the truth. God said, you eat of the fruit, you're going to surely die. They eat of the fruit, they don't die. So again, Satan has painted God into sort of a catch-22. And here's what the catch-22 is. If God allows Adam and Eve to experience the ultimate consequence of their choice, they do die. But then what happens? Two things happen. Number one, God loses them and the human race forever. They're dead and gone. And number two, what does Satan say? There he goes. You break some little rule and he kills you. So whichever approach God takes, Satan is going to paint it in a negative light for God. This happens to us all the time. Ecclesiastes 8:11 says this, because the sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily, therefore the heart of the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil. Because God expresses mercy and puts grace and mercy on us so we don't experience the consequences of our choices right away, because he does that, he takes on a liability. Mercy carries a liability for God. It's the liability that sin is not actually a destroyer and sin does not actually kill. So when he extends mercy to us, he's taking on a liability. That's part of what is defiling the sanctuary. That's one of the things that's defiling the sanctuary. God extending mercy to us, and that makes him take the responsibility that he may not be telling the truth. But on the flip side, if God doesn't extend mercy to us, we're done. We can't experience all the benefits of salvation that he has for us. So I just want to review these catch-22s real quickly with you. And this is how Satan is able to convince angels in heaven, and this is how he's convincing people down here on earth to buy into certain ideas and philosophies about God that cause us to have a dark picture of him. So Genesis chapter 3 we just looked at, if God allows Adam and Eve to experience the consequences of their sin, they die. And what happens? People fear God, and he looks vindictive. If he prevents their death and is merciful, then it looks like God's not telling the truth. He's untrustworthy. And there is no connection between sin and death. In Job 1 and 2, the catch-22 was that the blessings that God uses, that we experience from God, are just God trying to buy us off. Are there blessings to being a Christian and walking in God's way? Absolutely, there's blessings. But Satan paints those blessings as just God buying us off. But if God withholds blessings from us, what does Satan say? Oh, God doesn't care. There's no reason to be a Seventh-day Adventist Christian. There's no blessings in that. In Job chapter 4 we looked at, on the one hand, if God steps back and doesn't intervene, Satan says, you're crushed like a bug with no one regarding. But when God intervenes, what does Satan say? He says that God's controlling everything. He's micromanaging everything. So in all of these scenarios, Satan's approach is to paint God in a negative light. But Job sticks with God. He demonstrates that God's evaluation of his character was accurate. James 5:11 says, you have heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. Job had perseverance. Job is an example of breaking those links that Satan was trying to form with the sons of God. There was an argument about the character of Job. The weight of evidence that God brought to bear on the equation was, listen, Job loves me not because of the selfish things, not because of the hope of reward or the fear of punishment. Job loves me because he loves my character. He loves the principles of my kingdom. Because I love him. And Satan says, that's not true. He's operating on my principles. And the only way to find out which was the truth was what? To let that scenario play out. There's no other way that God could say to the universe, listen, Job's character is right. And that same reality will play out in the end of this world. When God has a generation that says, we want to follow you, we're 100% on your side, and Satan says, they're not on your side, they're on my side. It's just dressed up in some religious forms. They're just doing some things, going to some meetings, teaching Sabbath school, paying some tithes and offerings, but they're all doing it because they want to know what they'll have, just like Peter. Because they want to sit in the left and the right. They want to sit on a throne. They want to wear a crown. And God will say, as much as I don't want them to have to go through this, in order to demonstrate whether your charges are right or my claims about their character right, this process will have to go forward. And that statement there in education that we started with, that unselfishness is a principle that Satan denies exists, she goes on and says, by Job's patient endurance, he vindicated his own character, and thus the character of him, speaking about God, whose representative he was. Sometimes people have that like, well, you can't vindicate God's character. But it says here, by Job's patient endurance, Job vindicated his own character, and thus he vindicated the character of him, God, whose representative he was. So at the end of the story, we can appreciate that we have this privilege of standing up on God's side of the great controversy, of representing to not just those around us, as important as that is, but representing to the onlooking universe that God has actually done something in our lives and our experience, that whether there was no heaven to win or hell to shun, we like God, we love God, and we're on His side. If it's only 70 years and that's it, then I'm going to still be on God's side for 70 years. And I'd rather spend 70 years with God than an eternity without Him. And Job proves that experience. In the last generation, that's their privilege also. To disprove Satan's claim is the work of Christ. Christ proved He was on God's side 100%, and it was all because of His love for His Father and His love for us. But it's our privilege to prove that we're 100% on God's side for His sake and for the sake of those around us and of all who bear His name. So Satan's accusations about Job are being repeated every day, and that story of Job is each one of our stories. We may not have lost as much as Job lost. Although, God gave him everything back and twice as much at the end, didn't He? Like if you look at the numbers of camels and sheep and all that kind of stuff, there was twice as many at the end. And that's why I believe his children will be saved also. He had 10 children at the beginning, and God gave him 10 children at the end. So for in order that to be doubled like all the animals, those first 10 would have to be saved also. So I really believe that Job's intercession on his children's behalf paid dividends. And when Job gets to heaven, he's going to have 20 kids. Because God is faithful. God is faithful. Let's bow our heads. Dear Heavenly Father, I just want to thank You again for taking such a risk by being willing to claim us as Your representatives in this planet. Job came through, and so many times we fall short, Lord, but You've been faithful to us. You've been persistent and patient with us. And Lord, as we move through each day, and sometimes our trials may be great like Job, sometimes they're much less. But as we move through these challenges of this fallen world, may we appreciate that the privilege of representing Your kingdom and Your principles, of representing You, of representing the principle of unselfishness, that we can actually, yes, on some level reveal what You've done in our lives by our character, but most importantly, vindicate Your character and say God's love and goodness and personhood is worthy of whatever sacrifice we're called to make. So for myself and for this congregation, we invite You into our hearts, and we say, make us like Job and make us like Jesus. In Jesus' name, amen.